Where are the Poles in the audience? Sorry. Oh gosh, marvellous. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I speak to you as the Chairman has said, as the first Polish-born British Member of Parliament. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit this evening about why I campaigned for Brexit. Now, a lot of my Polish friends come up to me in my constituency and also around the country, slightly perplexed, some rather irritated that I campaigned for Brexit, in a rather disbelieving way. They say to me, how can you as a Pole campaign to pull Britain out of the European Union? So I'm going to attempt to try to explain to you in a quiet but methodical way why I felt compelled to campaign to pull out of the European Union. I'm very conscious of the fact that many young people, and I'm no longer young, but many young people are very passionate about the European Union and they believe in the European Union. And so I'm very conscious that many of you will, even some of you may want to have another referendum to try to overturn the previous referendum. So let me try and outline to you why I campaigned for Brexit and then take your questions. But I'm very proud, for those of you who are Polish in the audience, I have my friend Joseph Mikołaj Ray in the front here. We met at a Polonia conference earlier this year in Rzeszów, which is called 60 miliony, because of course there are 40 million Poles in Poland, but there are 20 million Poles living outside of Poland all around the world. And the United Kingdom benefits enormously by having 1 million Poles here in the United Kingdom. And as you know, Polish is now the second most widely spoken language on this island after English. But the Americans have even more. And Joseph, I think some estimates put it at how many Poles in the United States of America?
10 to 12 million.
10 to 12 million. You go to parts of Chicago and all the names in Chicago are written in Polish restaurants. There's a really large, big Polish community in Chicago. And so Joseph has been staying with me today in the House of Commons, and what we're trying to do, and this will dovetail, I hope, a little bit into my speech, what we're trying to do is we're trying to work together, the Polonia in Britain, to work with the Polonia in America, to work together across the Atlantic to try to promote bilateral relations between America, Britain and Poland. And that is the nub of the message that I want to get across to our Polish friends and neighbours when I go to Warsaw on Tuesday. And my speech will try to explain. What we want to say to the Poles is this: you feel passionately about two things. Defence, and this is a country that's been invaded on many occasions and occupied and subjugated to appalling oppression. You're interested in defence and trade. We, the Anglo-Saxon world, America, Britain and Canada, we can offer you the same level of defence and trade that the European Union can, without you being in the customs union, without you being in a political and currency union with us. Now, some of you will instinctively say, no, that's a pipe dream. It's impossible. What a naive objective for you to have. How could you possibly offer these countries like Poland the same level of defence and trade without being in a currency and political union? Well, that's my life's ambition, and I'm going to be starting it immediately after March of next year. Now, we joined the European Economic Community on the day I was born, the 24th of January 1972. So you have got one advantage over me. You're more intelligent than I am because you went to you're at Cambridge University, and I only managed to get into Stirling University in Scotland. But one thing I have which you don't have is experience of this entity over 46 years. Because we joined something called the European Economic Community, as I say, on the day I was born. And it was a completely different entity at that time. it has morphed into something completely unrecognizable from what we joined in 1972. And people of my generation have seen that massive change, huge amount of change in the relationship and in the ability of individual sovereign nations to be able to maintain and guard and protect their independence and their sovereignty. And if I was to take you into the House of Commons, you would be appalled at the amount of infighting and problems that this issue has constantly raised on the floor of the House of Commons. We should be focused on issues to do with further education funding, transport, infrastructure, education, all these things that matter to citizens. And yet, if you could join me in the crucible of the House of Commons, you would be amazed at the amount of time that this issue of our relationship with the European Union, with the EEC, then the EC, now the EU, is taking. A huge distraction from what we should be doing. And these people are not ideological headbangers. You know, some of us are described as anti-EU headbangers and nutcases and fruitcakes. We're not. We're just simply Democrats who have been elected by people who believe in our country, who believe in the sovereignty of our parliament, and we want to protect those rights that many generations have fought for, to safeguard and protect them in our own country. So it's a question of sovereignty and guarding your sovereignty, but it's also a question of accountability. I say to my constituents in Shrewsbury, I'll give you £100 if you can name me any of the members of the European Parliament that represent you. Haven't lost a penny in 13 years. Nobody knows who they are. Why? Because in our case, we are represented, we're called the West Midlands. We're an area of 6 million people. And the MEPs, none of them live in our community, none of them live in Shropshire, none of them have offices in Shropshire, none of them come to Shropshire, none of them hold surgeries in Shropshire, and by the way, they work in another country. So how is that bringing the people who make decisions on your behalf every day closer to you and more accountable to you? Because I'm a giant at 6'9", I'm recognizable in my constituency. And people stop me not just in my office. I go back to my constituency every single Friday. I live in my constituency. And people can get at me in my office, but they stop me in the supermarket, they stop me when I'm with my daughter in the swimming pool, they stop me in the sauna, they stop me in the park, and they say, Mr. Kawczynski, I don't like the way you're doing this, or I want you to do that. You've got to bring the politicians, the people who are making decisions on your behalf, ever closer to the people that they represent and make them more accountable, not to push that responsibility further away. Now, we did not just whimsically decide to pull out of the European Union. We made every attempt, believe you me, if you could have been part of those negotiations, we worked so hard to try to change the direction that the European Union was taking. 15 years ago, we decided there are 3 blocks in the European Parliament. There's the Liberal bloc, there's the Socialist bloc, and then there's the Conservative bloc. But the Conservative bloc was full of federalist conservative parties who believed in that movement towards a supranational state. So what we did, we worked with the Poles and the Czechs and the Hungarians and others, and we pulled out of the Conservative bloc, which was called the EPP-ED group, and we formed a brand new bloc for non-federalist conservative parties. And naively, we thought that we could work with these other like-minded people from Central and Eastern Europe to change the direction of travel of the European Union. We failed spectacularly because France and Germany are absolutely determined to carry on that movement towards a supranational state. And when Mr. Cameron came back after that renegotiation, he came back with a fig leaf. He came back with a fig leaf. He negotiated on our behalf for 2 years. He came back with a fig leaf, a meaningless piece of paper which we could not sell to our constituents. Please don't forget, in my constituency, UKIP, which is a party that I consider to be a malign extremist party, UKIP won the elections in the European Parliament elections. UKIP won the largest number of votes in this country at the last European elections. They won in my constituency the largest number of votes. They had over 10,000 votes in the election at the general election. So to completely ignore the concerns of the British people would be irresponsible. And when Cameron came back, it did not address the concerns of my constituents, and I felt I had to campaign for Brexit. I met with 20 top Polish students last week from the equivalent of Oxford and Cambridge. They came to see me from the top Polish universities. And I said to them, how much money do you think, I said to them, how many countries do you think put money into the tin, into the European Union? They didn't know. It's 2. 2 countries put money into the tin, all the other countries take money out. Britain and Germany are the ones that put money in. And I said to these Polish students, how much do you think the British taxpayer has put into the European Union tin net, after our rebates, after the money that we get back? And these Polish students said to me, anything between 5 and 20 billion pounds. They were shocked and surprised when I said that the figure was 598 billion pounds. Almost $1 trillion. Now I can take you to schools in my constituency with leaking roofs, poor installations, where they're making cutbacks to teaching assistants because there's not enough money. I can take you to my local hospital where people are still being put on trolleys at peak times and winter times because there are not enough spaces for them in hospital beds. We have a huge problem in this country with social ills and social problems, and yet we are handing over £200 million of British taxpayers' money every week to the European Union. Completely unsustainable. And it's not just about immigration and the jurisdiction of our Supreme Court that people voted for. They saw the direction of travel over the last 46 years, and they thought to themselves, no, we want to get off. This is far enough for us. We're getting off now because we don't think that we can get off further down the line. This structure is moving so rapidly towards a supranational state, it will be impossible further down the line to make the decision to try to leave. Now, they are doing all the things to create a single state. The people who abuse me the most on Twitter, and I get a lot of abuse on Twitter, are the people who abuse me most on Twitter. Do you know what they have next to their photographs? Well, a lot of them are faceless. They don't put their pictures. But do you know what they have? They have one flag. They have the European Union flag on their Twitter accounts. Not the British flag. They don't identify with the English flag or the British. They identify with the European Union flag. So the European Union is creating the branding of a single flag. They have a single parliament. Mr. Juncker has said that he wants his legacy to be a single president of the EU Commission. And now they are talking about a single European army, and of course they're moving towards a single European currency. Now all of you in this room will know that there are 19 Eurozone countries. 19 out of the 27. But the other countries have no right not to join the Eurozone. They have signed up, upon signing to be a member of the European Union, they have signed into law that they have no right to continue with their own currencies. At some stage in the future, they will have to ditch their own currencies and they will have to adopt the euro. When Britain pulls out, there is only one country with a permanent opt-out from the Eurozone. Anybody know who that is? Denmark. Are you Danish?
No.
Right. Correct. Denmark. Little Denmark is the only country that has a permanent opt-out. That the people of Denmark said, no, we're not going to adopt the euro. But the problem with this is, and I don't believe what I say to you, find out for yourself. Go and look at the opinion polls in all of these countries. The people in some of these countries are overwhelmingly opposed to ditching their own currencies. In Poland, the country of my birth, I think in the latest opinion polls, only 25% of the electorate want to ditch the zloty. In Germany, Helmut Kohl admitted that if they had had a referendum, the German people would have voted to retain the Deutschmark. The German people would have rejected the euro currency. So every country, many countries haven't even been consulted. The people of many countries haven't even been consulted as to whether or not they want to keep their currencies. Their governments have made that decision for them. And in Poland, as I say, only 25% of the electorate want to give up their currency. So when they bludgeon these 7 countries into abandoning their own currencies, and by the way, I said to Joseph today, we will go back to Poland if needs be, and we will raise the money to take the government to court, if needs be, to insist that there is a national referendum on whether or not they abandon the zloty. If I have to go and beg in the street myself, I'll do it, but there will be a referendum, because we are not going to allow any government, which is transitory anyway, to make a monumental decision like that to destroy the national currency and therefore to make the National Bank of Poland redundant and have no influence over your macroeconomic policy. And by the way, it wasn't the politicians who decided to keep the pound sterling 20 years ago, it was you, the British people. The British people 20 years ago made it absolutely clear. Carry on with your European Union project, carry on sending the money over, but you're not ditching our currency. And they were very, very intelligent, I think, the British people, because if we had abandoned our currency, we would not have left the European Union. Too many people would have been petrified to vote to pull out of the European Union and change their currency at the same time. It would have created economic... You think the negotiations are difficult now. It would have created huge economic turmoil to pull out of the European Union and change the currency at the same time. So what the European Union is trying to do is they're trying to slowly bind sovereign nations to the common European Union project so that future generations have no alternative but to continue with the supranational state. I want to take your questions, so I'll only speak for a little bit longer. I think the chairman said to me about 10 minutes. But I feel very passionately about what Poland went through during the Second World War. And this is a special message to the Poles in the room. I went to Warsaw last year to receive an award on behalf of my family. Many of them were shot by the Germans for hiding Jewish friends and neighbours on the farm. Poland was the only country in occupied Europe where there was the death penalty for protecting Jewish people. And my family, knowing that risk, took that, decided to help and protect Jews. And my uncle, the brother of my grandfather, had to watch his 12-year-old daughter being shot, then his wife, and then he was killed by the Germans because they were hiding and protecting Jewish friends and neighbours on their estate near Koło in western Poland. So I feel very sensitive about what Poland went through during the Second World War. And I think it's very difficult for people in this country to understand the sheer horror, the barbarism of what happened to Poland during the Second World War. When I take delegations of British MPs to Warsaw, as well as all the official meetings, I make sure I take them to the Warsaw Uprising Museum so they can see firsthand what happened just to Warsaw. 95% of it completely flattened. Children killed. Innocent little children killed because they were helping with the uprising. It was awful. And so, of course, security and peace for Poland is very, very important. And what is the organization that has kept the peace on the continent of Europe for 70 years? NATO. NATO. I have people coming up to me in my constituency and saying, Mr. Kawczynski, but the European Union has kept the peace in Europe. Nothing to do with the European Union. NATO has kept the peace on the continent of Europe. And when we pull out of the European Union, there will be 6 countries that are inextricably linked to the common defence of our continent that are not and will never be members of the European Union. 2 of whom are permanent members of the UN Security Council. America and Britain. Canada also, Iceland, Norway and Turkey. Think about for a moment about those 6 countries. America and Canada, America and Britain, 2 permanent members of the UN Security Council. Who will help to protect, to keep the Atlantic open in the event of a war? Canada and Iceland. Look at Norway in the extreme north, bordering Russia. Look at Turkey, protecting our southern flank, next to Syria and Iraq. It's extremely important that we keep NATO as the supreme defence posture for the continent of Europe, rather than the European army. Now, I have people in Brussels saying, we can't rely on the British and the Americans to protect us anymore. We can't rely on these people. We have to form a single European army. I take great exception to that when you think about the huge number of British soldiers that were killed in 2 world wars trying to protect these countries in terrible times, many in my constituency. We only just finished paying off our debts from World War II 5 years ago. This country has made huge sacrifices and done the very best it can to try to maintain the peace in Europe. And so we must maintain NATO. Europe has the opposite of the Midas touch. Anything it touches turns to dust. Look at the Eurozone crisis. Look at the misery in Greece and what the Greek people have been subjugated to. Look at the catastrophic mismanagement of the humanitarian crisis in the Mediterranean, where they can't even coordinate how to deal with all these poor, innocent sub-Saharan Africans who are being trafficked across the Mediterranean. We cannot allow the Brussels bureaucrats, in addition to everything else they're taking on board, to take on the common defence of our continent. I will end by saying that, particularly for our American audience, I'm astounded that in Germany today, in the latest opinion poll, only 30% of Germans think that America is a force for good. 30% of Germans think America is a force for good. Americans are always surprised when I say nice things about them, because I think a lot of Americans are subjugated to an extraordinary amount of criticism and hostility when they come to our country. And it hasn't been happened, them electing a rather controversial man to represent them. But nevertheless, I think that the sacrifices that the Americans have made in 2 world wars, and particularly how they saved Germany from fascism and also from communism, is extremely important, and our relationship with the world's only superpower is extremely important. 8% of British companies trade with the European Union, only 8%, and our single largest customer is the United States of America. Today, I have brought with me my friend, by sheer chance, because he was visiting me, my friend from America, and my researcher at the back there, who is from Sierra Leone. He's studying at Rochester University in New York State, but he's from Freetown in Sierra Leone. What I find amazing is that we, English, we have connections with, there are 58 English-speaking countries around the world. 58 countries in the world speak English. 1.5 billion people speak English. That's 20% of the world population. This country is unique in our ability to engage with these hugely important partners in the English-speaking world. 2 very different countries, Sierra Leone and America. You couldn't get 2 more contrasting countries. One in Africa, one in North America. But huge opportunities for Britain in both America, Sierra Leone, and throughout the whole of the Commonwealth. In your lifetimes, according to the European Union, 95% of the world's growth will come from outside of the European Union. 95% of the world's growth will be outside of the European Union. It'll be coming in places like America, Sierra Leone, China, India, Indonesia, Brazil. These huge, massive economic tigers that are going to completely revolutionize the way the global economy works. These countries are the future for us. And we, as an English-speaking nation, must be at the very heart of creating a very special trading relationship with these countries, rather than focusing on such a tiny part of the world. When I was first elected 13 years ago, 52% of our exports went to the European Union. That figure is now down to 39% and falling. Why? Because the European Union is getting smaller by the day as a percentage of global GDP and global output. So we must look to the world and make Brexit a success, continue with strong relations with the European Union, but protect our sovereignty and be a sovereign nation state again. Thank you very much.